Garden State Debate, where the talk is real. Garden State Debate, no joke, no frills. Garden State Debate is the talk of the town. Garden State Debate, for people all around. Yeah, Garden State Debate, Garden State Debate, Garden State Debate.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Garden State Debate. We hope you're able to check out the previous episode, which featured the Chief Medical Officer of Overlook Medical Center, Dr. Audette, who gave us a very detailed play-by-play of the battle of coronavirus from day one to what he expects to see in the fall of 2020. Now, in today's show, we're extremely fortunate to have with us Dr. Peter Woolley from Fairleigh Dickinson University on the show to talk to us about polling. Dr. Woolley is the head of the School of Public Global Affairs at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and he also co-founded FDU Polls in 2001. Now, you've probably seen and heard FDU poll results, and Professor Woolley himself quoted in and around the New Jersey media, as well as regional, national, and global media alike. Dr. Woolley's research in public opinion and his public commentary have been cited in news outlets from the Sydney Morning Herald to the Washington Post and the Trenton Times, from NJN to CNN, and newspapers from Alaska's Ketchikan Daily News to the Miami Herald. Today, among other topics in polling, we're going to tackle subjects that include what goes into a poll and what's the process behind polling. What happened in the 2016 presidential election? Did the pollsters get it wrong? And why do we even bother measuring public opinion? We're all educated, informed people, right? All of that and more on today's episode with Dr. Peter Woolley. Music and instrumentals and lyrics provided by the very talented Jairus Cook. Please enjoy the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Garden State Debate. I'm Ryan Felmont. I'll be your host, and we're very fortunate today to have Professor Peter Woolley with us, who's joining us from FDU, Fairleigh Dickinson University. And today's topic that we're going to be discussing in detail with Dr. Woolley is polling. Peter Woolley, as you've heard, is a co-founder of the FDU polling system, and for approximately 20 years. And we're very fortunate to have him with us today. We're going to go over a number of topics from kind of what I call polling 101. I think we all kind of want to know what's gone into polling, how has it potentially changed over the course of 10 or more years with technology and things like that. We're going to discuss the 2016 election and did the pollsters get it right? Did they get it wrong? Peter's going to educate us on that. And we're also going to talk to Dr. Woolley about polling in general and why is it important. If we're all, educated, informed citizens, watching debates, reading the news, then what can people or corporations or organizations get out of polling? So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Woolley. Welcome to the show. We're pleased to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to ask if you had anything else you'd like to add about today's show, some of the stuff we're going to get into, or anything else on your background that you just wanted to highlight before we jump into it.
No, I'm looking forward to it. And I think what I'm going to tell you basically is that pollsters are actually the good guys in this game.
All right. That's good to hear. I can't wait to hear about it. So just to start off, if we can start off from square one, can you kind of give us a broad summary of polling in general? If like the landscape of polling, we can use New Jersey's example in FDU's polling. What does a poll look like? Kind of what goes into it? And do you see any differences between what you know about, obviously, FDU polling and some of the others, such as Monmouth or Quinnipiac or some of the national polls?
So polling is basically a representation using a few people of a larger group of people, right? So what we do is we take a sample, and that sample can be infinitesimally small compared to the population it's meant to represent. But the key is that it is representative. And to be representative, it has to be randomly drawn. Now, just think about this analogy, right? When we test your blood, right, we don't draw all your blood, right? We don't drain your body, test it, and put it back. We can take a pinprick anywhere in your body, it really doesn't matter, and test that blood, because the blood is randomized in your system, right? Now, we do that with people as well. We take a little pinprick, a little sample of people, whether it's 400 or 1,200 or 1,500, and it may represent 1 million or 8 million or 200 million people. But if it's randomized, then it's going to be a good representation.
Got it.
And in that effort, I mean, I will add that there's very little daylight, if any, say, between Monmouth University, Fairleigh Dickinson University, Quinnipiac University, Gallup. These are very standard polling organizations using very standard methodologies. If there's any daylight, it's between the standard university methods or people like Gallup and partisan polls, right? So campaigns employ polls, and when somebody says, I have an internal poll from one of the campaigns, my advice to any reporter is run. Nobody releases an internal poll without the intention of trying to persuade people that something is true that's not true, right? These are, by definition, partisans. So why anybody reports polls coming from campaigns, I would like to say I don't know, but I do know. And the reason is because the campaign is trying to prevent losing, and it's trying to goose up its donors, right? So when the donors see that the candidate is behind, the donors are less willing to hand over money. When the donors see the candidate is ahead, they're more willing to donate money. And that's all it is.
Got it. Thank you. That makes sense. And as far as like a given poll is set out, is there like a target demographic that you look at for a given poll based on the topic of the poll? Does that drive who you're trying to reach? Or is the random sampling that's being taken into account, is that kind of pretty stable, like the formula that might be behind it from one to the next? In terms of the amount of people, the technology you're using, who you're trying to contact, is it like kind of phone-based, or do you use social media with technology changing over the years? Kind of I know that's a lot of different questions, but just to get a sense of kind of someone who may have not been ever contacted by a poll, back to your pinprick point of view. Obviously, you can gather a small sampling and then you can extrapolate it into something wider. So that's probably the reason for that. But just for people that don't know, that have never been contacted, actually like myself, they probably want to know something like what goes into it in terms of the background.
Well, to answer your question about who you target in a poll, it really depends whose opinion you want, right? So if we want to know the opinion, say, of pharmacists and physicians, and we want to know whether or not they recognize that in a particular drug, there may be a significant difference, say, between the brand name drug and the generic drug. And we might target those people because they're the people who are dealing with that drug. If they say there's no difference between the generic and the brand name drug, and yet there is a scientific difference, let's say in the absorption rate, that's a problem, right? If we want to know whether students would like a dramatic change in their food service in the campus cafeteria, then we're going to, of course, only ask those students. And by the way, in that case, we've done that, And what we do is we do what we call a canvas. So rather than email or text the students or contact them by social media, we actually post people on the approaches to all the dining halls. And we buttonhole students according to a randomized system. And we ask them right there and then to complete the questionnaire. Now, if it's voters you want to know, well, then you have to ask the question, are you a registered voter at the place where you now live? Or when you draw your sample, you have to get it from a registered voter list, which are available very easily in most states. So it really depends on who you want to sample. Now, it's more complicated if you want to find out the opinion of likely voters. And of course, that's a big source of debate and consternation among pollsters in particular, because we don't want to know how people who are not going to vote are going to vote, right? We only want to know the people who are going to come out and vote. And if you think about it, that's really only a portion, a fraction of all the eligible voters. So there are eligible voters who are not registered to vote, and there are registered voters who only vote sometimes. There are registered voters who vote never, registered voters who vote always. And there are registered voters who move from state to state and find, surprise, surprise, they're not eligible. So it's hard work, and it's very debatable, contentious, how to identify who is a likely voter. And of course, bad pollsters will hide behind bad results, claiming that they know better about who's a likely voter or not. And good pollsters will admit that it's a difficult call. You need a complex system to sort of weed out the people who are unlikely to show up at the polls.
Thank you for that. And another question that I have is FDU polling. Do you guys distinguish yourselves more from a regional New Jersey perspective or from a national? You talked a little bit about political polling and some of the gray areas or the difficulties and challenges of it. But so it seems like you're probably FDU is probably doing a lot of local, regional as well as national. Is it sort of like a 50-50 breakdown, or do you do more? I mean, you talked about on-campus polling, and you talked about political, probably presidential or maybe congressional polling. Is there a breakdown for FDU?
Well, you're right. We do polling in New Jersey. We do polling nationally, but I think more important, we do polling that's driven by our client list. So we do a lot of polling for hire for various kinds of clients who want various kinds of populations tested. But I use the example of pharmacists and physicians. That's a real life example. Sometimes we do very, very targeted polling. But I think the way we really distinguish ourselves is in experimental polling. We do things that other pollsters don't do. We get at things that are hard to poll straight ahead. So for example, some years ago, you may remember there was a TV show called Jersey Shore. And these were a bunch of Staten Island people who were down at the shore in New Jersey. And they were mindless and uneducated and directionless and sloppy. And for whatever reason, the show was a great big hit in the day. And the reaction to that show among elected officials in New Jersey was very adverse. And it became a mantra to say that the Jersey Shore show is hurting New Jersey, that these people aren't from New Jersey and they're giving us a bad reputation, and don't let these people come to your town. And the one way people got at the question of whether it's hurting New Jersey or not is they simply asked people, do you think it helps New Jersey? Do you think it hurts New Jersey? Or don't you know? And so poll after poll by other pollsters would report that Jersey Shore hurts New Jersey. Why? Because people say it does. Now, if you think about it, that's pretty dumb, right? Just because people say something is true, or they think it's true or might be true doesn't make it true, right? That's not science, right? So the question is then, how do you find out whether really or not that TV show is hurting New Jersey or not? Well, this is how you do it. You ask two very different questions. First, you ask, have you ever seen the show Jersey Shore? That's what we really want to know, right? Because if you've seen it or not seen it, you may have a very different impression of the thing we're trying to measure, which is your view of New Jersey. And what we ask you, secondly, is do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of New Jersey? And we don't necessarily ask the questions in that order. We might randomize the order. That's very important as well. But what we're trying to get at is, nationally, do people who have not seen the show have a different impression of New Jersey than people who have seen the show? And the answer was yes. In fact, people who had seen Jersey Shore had a much more favorable impression of New Jersey than people who had not seen the show, right? So the show, in fact, was a positive force, and almost 20 percentage points greater of people who saw the show had a favorable view of New Jersey. And why not, right? You're showing the shore. You're not showing the turnpike. You're showing the beach. You're not showing the oil refineries. You're showing the water. You're showing people having a good time, right? So it was in fact, everybody in elected office who condemned that show could not have been more wrong. That show actually was, perversely perhaps, a promotion for New Jersey.
That's actually really interesting, and I think it shows a lot about how you can back into the opinion through different angles to get the output that you saw. So thank you for that. And I know a lot of probably listeners have tuned in, whether they would say it publicly or not, to your other point, and have seen that show at one time or another. So that's very interesting. And you brought up a good point about what drives polling, what drives the topics. So that raises the question as to how are polls budgeted? Obviously it varies in terms of where it's located, but at FDU, is it budgeted through the school, or is it through grants or some sort of external funding? How does that work, and how does that factor into the topics that are actually explored?
And that's right. So the answer is all of the above, right? So the university gives us the stake, and then we get our own grants that come in, and then we have a client list. We have people who come to us and ask for exploration. So, and one way that's done is, they want a full-blown study, standalone study, like the pharmacists and the physicians, or they may just want a few questions in a statewide study, like Garden State Initiative did a few months ago, or they might want a few questions on a national study, in which case we basically charge them by the question or by the minute. And so we sell minutes on our survey the way you sell seats on a train, a bus, or a plane, right? And then
so what happens when you get approached by a corporation or an entity that wants to do a poll on a topic, and they're assuming a certain result, and it works against them in terms of what they're expecting to see? They're still charged a full bill, or how does that play out? It doesn't get published?
In most cases, what we say at this outset is that we have control over the questions. We ultimately have editorial control over the questions, and we're not going to allow an unfair or unbalanced question, because we're a university here. We're not here to be a bunch of carnival barkers for a corporation. So most people accept that. A few do not. We had an animal rights group come to us a few years ago, and they wanted to ask a question about, really to affect the question of a bear hunt. And their question was something like, do you think it's okay for a hunter to shoot a bear cub who's nursing at its mother's breast? Well, no, that's not really that's not really a question that should be brought into the debate. It's obviously constructed on one side. And we told them so, and they went away. So that does happen, that people can't accept that the study is going to be fair and balanced. For most of these groups, however, we do sign a non-disclosure clause because they're paying for the data. If they don't want to release it or make it public, they don't need to release it or make it public. It's their data, they bought it. But we also say that if you make it public and if you misrepresent it, then we have the right to make a public statement, right? So that's how we protect ourselves.
I think that's really good information for the listeners and sort of like polling integrity, right? Since it's funded, so some of it be funded by external bodies that are looking for information, but you're protecting the obviously the line of questioning and also any media or statements that come out about it. So that's very interesting. Thank you for that. And then just to kind of wrap up, like polling, the polling basics, and then I'd like to talk about the 2016 election and some other stuff. But from a statistical error rate, it seems like that comes up once in a while. It's like, well, what's the error rate of this poll or that poll, and how does it matter? And do pollsters do some sort of kind of like regression analysis or like back checking the success rate of the poll? Is that something that exists in the polling world, or is that just something that is in the media and is talked about? And how valuable do you see that?
Well, there are actually two items in that question. First, what you're calling the error rate is, I think what you mean is the margin of error. So
yes.
A poll that's truly randomized will have a calculable margin of error. Now, that's very important for a couple reasons. One is that people don't realize, and the corporate media certainly completely overlooks the fact that polling is a scientific method to arrive at an estimate, right? I'm going to say that again. Polling is a scientific method to arrive at an estimate. So that's where the calculable margin of error comes in. Let's just say if the margin of error is plus or minus 4 percentage points. That means basically any reported result is likely to be within 4 percentage points plus or minus of the result that we're reporting, any of those numbers. And it will be within that margin 19 out of 20 times. And that 20th time, it's going to be outside the margin. In other words, if it's truly random poll and if we calculate a margin of error, we are still saying 1 out of every 20 times we are likely statistically to be outside of our own margin of error. And this is important, right? Because as scientific as we can be in the method, the whole science of polling still only arrives at an estimate. Now, most of those estimates are very good. And you can see in some cases, a reputable polling outfit after reputable polling outfit replicate results within just a point or two of one another. And you can be pretty confident of those results. But it also points to the fact that there are other ways of introducing error into these surveys, which sometimes people do unknowingly, sometimes they do knowingly. They're trying to push the result in one direction or another. And sometimes, frankly, if the poll is not properly randomized, you cannot report a margin of error. And that is a mistake that a lot of outfits do make. They do not have a random sample, and yet they're reporting a margin of error. And so that's not something any university poll or any respectable corporate poll would do. But some people do that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think you kind of laid it out, but the size of a poll is people probably look at a poll, some people, and they see, oh, FDU or Monmouth, Quinnipiac, CNN, whatever. They only took a sample size of 200 people, but they're,
Yeah,
extrapolating it to like you said, it drives, it's public opinion. So does the size, the actual raw size of how many people you're contacting actually play a role in that, in the result, in the error, in the
yeah. It plays a role within very narrow parameters. In other words, probably the smallest sample we would take is 400, and 400 yields a margin of error, assuming your respondents are randomized, of plus or minus 5%. But if you get up to 1,200, right? If you triple that sample, your margin of error is still going to be just plus or minus 3%. So you've tripled the sample, but you've reduced the margin of error only by 2 percentage points. So what I'm saying is the size matters, but within a fairly narrow range. If you take a sample of 10,000 people, you're going to spend boatloads of money, and you're not really going to get any more of a reliable result. You will, and the margin of error declines in a very small increment from 400 on. So most polls you'll see are between 400 up to 1,200, sometimes 1,500. And the reason to have the larger polling pool, by the way, is not necessarily to reduce the margin of error calculation. It's actually so that you can see what's going on with subgroups. What you want to see in a poll of 1,200 is what is the difference between men and women? What is the difference between white voters and non-white voters? What is the difference between households that make $100,000 and more and households that make $100,000 or less? What is the difference between people who have children in school and people who don't, right? So what you really want to do, say with a sample of 800, 900, 1,200, whatever it is look at the subgroups and have enough people in those subgroups so that statistically you can say something meaningful and reliable.
Understood. That makes sense. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot of the diminishing quality of once you hit a certain number. Obviously, there's not an infinite budget, and once you hit a certain number, it's the additional 1,000 or 500 or however many people that you're pulling provides little value, especially related to the expense.
Right, but it does provide. You're right, but it does provide value for subgroups, though. And just going back to the example of the bear hunt. In fact, we went out and asked this question on our own dime, and very simply, do you favor or oppose a bear hunt in New Jersey? Right? Very simple, straight up. Now, people who favor it outnumber people who do not favor it historically. But what's interesting to me is that there's a big gender gap, right? Men are far more likely to favor a bear hunt than women. So if you're addressing this as a policy issue, as a campaign issue, that's maybe something you want to take into account, right? That you're going to have, that you have two different audiences here between men and women. And of course, that's true on a lot of important issues and important policy issues, that men and women and other subgroups in your demographics will vary significantly.
Okay, understood. Thank you for that. And just to kind of segue into the next topic, really, and you brought it up earlier, which would be political polling and maybe some of the difficulties that go along with that, or some of the misnomers that we read in the media, and how people view it. Can you give us a sense of what happened in 2016? I'll just tell you real quick that from what we hear from the media, the pollsters got it wrong. They, President Trump won the election. Hillary Clinton appeared to be winning in the polls, albeit marginally in certain states and this and that, but then on the national level, I think she might have been winning those as well. So can you walk us through that? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a trope that's been going around, that the polls in 2016 were somehow wrong. And I think that's completely wrong. And it's one of these things that has traction, and people now just repeat it mindlessly. All they know is that they thought Hillary was going to win, and she didn't. Well, I have big news for them. This is not a national election. This is a state-by-state election. This is not a winner-take-all election for the national popular vote. This is something called the Electoral College, and whose votes are counted state by state. So the fact is that the national polling in 2016 was very accurate. It predicted, or it showed rather, that Hillary was ahead by 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points, looking at the range of polls there. And in fact, she did come out ahead in the national count. And she did get millions more votes than did Donald Trump. But it's also true, of course, that Donald Trump won the election because he won more electoral votes. He won by very, very razor-thin margins in a number of states, right? So first thing is, it's important to say the national polling was extremely accurate in 2016, and to say otherwise is just false. Well, what about the state polls? Were they misleading? And in fact, a number of those state polls were misleading, and a number of those state polls actually were not very reputable outfits or experienced outfits. In some cases, you had local media outlets doing robocalling and outsourcing this, trying to save a buck and doing a poor job. But the key thing, even in those state polls, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, is that most of those polls pegged Hillary Clinton's vote share very well, right? And that's important. That's the first data point we have. You say these polls were all off. Well, actually, they weren't all off. First thing to say is they got Hillary Clinton's vote share pretty close. So what were they doing? Well, they were apparently underestimating or underreporting the Trump vote. Now, does that mean there were shy Trump voters? No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that people who were undecided tended to break for Trump, who they perceived as a challenger to the status quo, more than they tended to vote for Hillary Clinton. So if you look at that, the independent voting, or vote share, I should say, in many of those state polls, and you allocate that, let's just say, by a 2-to-1 ratio to Donald Trump, then you find you have an accurate result. But it's very important, when we look at horse race results, often in the corporate media, and of course it's even worse in the social media, people tend to overlook this large population who are independents. I have a slide here. I'm going to put that up on the screen for us. And I'm not going to leave out our listeners. I'm going to describe this a little bit. What we have here on this slide is national polling data from Bloomberg, The Economist, ABC, Washington Post, and Fox News. And all but one shows Clinton ahead by 3 or 4 points, which turned out to be very accurate. All of these outfits are taking a sample of likely voters, which is to say they're trying to find people who are actually going to go to the polls and not merely saying they are. There's a significant number of people who say, oh yes, I'm going to vote, but then come the day, they do not. So everybody's trying to focus on just the likely voters. The RPC average of all these polls shows on this slide that Hillary is a little more than 2 percentage points ahead of Trump, which turned out to be accurate. But what's missing from all these polls? You'll see in the Bloomberg poll, which shows Hillary ahead 44 to 41, there are 9 percentage points which are unallocated. That is to say, these are people who are saying they're undecided. They haven't decided yet in this election who they're going to vote for. The Economist YouGov poll, there are 7 percentage points who are undecided. And if you think about that, 7 percentage points undecided potentially can upset your election. So it's very important for voters, for observers, certainly for campaign managers, but more important for, say, corporate media, to talk about the people in the poll who have not yet decided whether they're going to vote and whether they are going to break evenly for the two candidates or whether they're going to break in one direction more than another. Another thing we should point out then is that when you take this down to the state level, what you find is that some of the state level polls had an unreasonable percentage of undecided voters. If you have 14, even if you have 9, 10, 11, 12% undecided, there's probably something wrong with your likely voter model. You have to move some of those people out. Secondly, if you have such a large undecided population, you should probably do what we've done in several elections, and that is to say, after we report our poll results for the big horse race, what we'll go do is we'll go back to that undecided population and recontact them, and we'll ask them, have you made up your mind? Are you leaning in one direction or another? And what we really want to find out among that population is, are they breaking one way or another? Because the rule of thumb typically is about a third of the undecided will break for candidate A, about a third will break for candidate B, and about a third will not show up at the polls. So it won't change your final result. But if those undecided voters are going to break in one direction or another, in a close election, it will change your mind. Now, I put up a slide of the last week of the election, polling in the last week of the election, which shows not who is ahead and who is behind. It shows the answer to a completely different and very important question. And that question is, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of candidate A? Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of candidate B? And what we show on this slide is that the Monday, a week before the election, Hillary Clinton had a 14-point advantage over Donald Trump in favorables. That is to say, 14 percentage points more of the population or of her supporters had a favorable view of her as compared to Donald Trump. What you see in the slide then is that 7 days later, her margin of 14 has slowly eroded until it's just 5 points. Now, think back to that week. What happened in that week before the election? Something very important changed this trend line about favorables. And the answer is?
The Comey release,
Yeah,
the
that's
report.
exactly what it was. So Comey comes out a week before the election, a little more than a week before the election, says, hold on, I know I said before that the email thing was over, but it's not over. We decided there's something more here, and I'm letting you know in the interest of full disclosure. And of course, the Trump campaign was able to seize on that, and that became a big driving news story, and it clearly eroded Clinton's net favorables. And you can see that she lost in that week 9 percentage points under the radar, right? Because people were not reporting that, but it was there to be reported. And so what you see there is not that this is going to change people's votes from Clinton to Trump or from Trump to Clinton. People who are decided do not cross the aisle. Do not say, never mind, I'm not going to vote for Hillary, I'm going to vote for Trump. It's the undecided who are primarily affected. And that decline in Hillary Clinton's favorables was just enough to erode any advantage she might have had among those undecided. And those,
Professor Woolley, do you mind just explaining for the audience, when we say net favorables, I mean, we obviously get the general insight to what that means, but is that in relation to the the unknown vote, the independent vote, whatever?
Well, this slide is all voters, right?
Okay.
So we're saying, when we say a net favorable, what we mean is we take the percentage of people who have a favorable opinion of you, and we subtract the percentage of people who have a negative opinion of you.
Got
And
it.
that's your net favorable, right? So what are Clinton's net favorables as compared to Trump's net favorables? Well, Clinton's way over the top, right? At the start of the week. But at the end of the week, the trend shows that she's now very close to Trump. Trump's net favorables have actually increased. Her net favorables had decreased, and now they're only 5 percentage points apart. So what does that suggest? On the Saturday before the election, people are going to head into the voter booth with more doubt about Hillary Clinton. And of course, the people who matter in Wisconsin, where Donald Trump's only won by 22,000 votes, are the people who previously had been undecided, right? So the polls aren't wrong. The polls have all the evidence right there. And a few outfits were watching this trend. So you look at 538.com. They picked up this trend and began to completely change their forecast of how the election was going to come out in a state-by-state model. And so they began to change that forecast at the end of this very bad week before the election, with just a few more days to run. And of course, that's what happened, right? So you have enough undecided voters breaking in a handful of close states for the perceived challenger rather than for the perceived incumbent or status quo.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah.
These slides definitely make it more clear as to, and your outline of them as to what happened during 2016. And you touched on a little bit the unknown votes, or people that were contacted who didn't have a pick per se, and you would call, or a pollster would call them back, and they would try to dig in deeper, and they would try to. So is that have pollsters take that? Obviously, that seems like probably one of the biggest challenges, or tell us if it's not. But is that something that's being worked on in terms of? It's been 4 years. We're about to go through it again. So I'm just interested as to, will we be seeing the same type of favorables and the same, and if we see a 5 to 10 point of unknowns, what should the public think? I mean, how do we try to grasp that bucket of unknowns, and has there been any positive in terms of trying to dig into that a little bit more?
Well, look, what I'm trying to say is that information is readily available. That information is provided by pollsters, whether or not it's analyzed, carried, amplified by media, whether it's social media or corporate media, is another thing altogether. If there's one thing that the public can grasp in 2020 or any other presidential year, it's again that this is not really a national election. This is not a contest for the most votes nationally. This is a contest for the most votes in Oklahoma, North Carolina, North Dakota, Wisconsin, etc. These are really 51, counting Washington, D.C., different contests.
So sorry to interrupt. So do you anticipate maybe some more spending in the actual state by state polling? Obviously, to your point about the popular vote, that's great to see, but it doesn't determine the output of the election. So why are so many pollsters polling at that level? I'm guessing it's because of budget. But why wouldn't they focus on like the purple states or the swing states or whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, well, in years past, there have been things like the battleground poll, where people have pooled their resources and concentrated only on a handful of states that are rich in electoral votes and likely to be very close on election day. So that does happen, but it is enormously expensive, and it's getting more expensive all the time. Back in the day when most people used a landline and a cell phone was really something of a novelty, it was one financial calculation. But actually, calling people on cell phones is almost triple the cost of holding an interview on the old landline. And so actually, I know it's mundane, but it's true. Somebody's got to pay the bill at the end of the day for these interviews, which can run up to $40, $50 per interview. Now you multiply that times 1,000. Well, for some people, that's actually real money, right?
I think that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. These polls are not cheap, and they're getting more expensive all the time because the need to randomize your sample means that it's harder and harder to contact people in a more and more atomized social media environment, right? Where we all have our own cell phone and we're all ignoring people in our own way. I do it. I'm sure you do it. And so pollsters really, have to make a lot more effort to break through and get that randomized sample.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Just a quick question, kind of between our first topic and this, and you kind of touched on it again, the landline versus mobile. Is for political polling, is phone the kind of the golden, the silver bullet for polling? And then if it is, then just in general, maybe not, from what you see across the landscape. And then on top of that, when someone answers the phone, what if they're, family of four? What if they're in a multi-generational household? How do pollsters try to speak to more than one person? Do they ask for the oldest male? Do they ask for, how would they go about finding the person? But the first question is the phone the golden source?
Yes, phone interviews are still considered the gold standard of polling, but it's so expensive. People are hard at work at finding alternatives, and they're also hard at work at mixing modes. The key, no matter what method you use to contact people, is to make sure you have, as best you can, a randomized sample, whether you're using landlines or cell phones. That's the goal. Now, the reason we don't use landlines, or we use landlines less and less, is because fewer and fewer people have landlines. There are states in which 70% of the population do not have a landline. So we obviously, the 30% who are left are not representative of the whole population, right? If you to be direct, if you only contact people by landline, you're probably only going to get a sample of people who are 65 and older. Well, on the one hand, people 65 and older are more likely to vote than the rest of the population. On the other hand, they're not the rest of the population, and there's a lot of voters that are not represented by that population. So people are hard at work. It is expensive. There are all kinds of alternatives we're looking for. But look, this is the history of polling. As the method of communication shifts over the past 100 years, really, pollsters adjust.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I think a lot of people are going to find kind of the background into what goes into it, some of the unknowns, and the process to be very, very interesting. As you said, the media likes to talk about polls. Candidates like to talk about polls when they're winning, certain looking better in certain races and things like that. So they put a lot of weight on them. But the general public, knowledgeable as they are, and maybe they're tainted by 2016. I don't know, but the media, like you mentioned before, kind of puts a different rub on it without going into what are the underlying factors and what are the actual facts and science behind polling. So I think that's really helpful, and I appreciate it. I don't know I'm not sure if FDU's done anything yet, but are you looking across polling yet for the 2020 election and seeing anything sticking out, or is that something that will be coming since we're still not even in October? Just wondering if you had any general insights as to some of the stuff you're seeing across the polling landscape, or if it's probably maybe too early. Based on your last slide, it's several weeks too early.
No, you know what? It's never too early to pick up trends. And that's one of the things that pollsters are best at, is picking up trends. A lot of people like to say polling is about taking a snapshot. And that's true to a limited extent. More important is you take a series of snapshots, and then you look at the differences between those snapshots and ask yourself, are we going in one direction or another, right? So if you're a campaign, obviously you want to know, are you gaining or losing momentum? Now, the interesting thing I think about 2020, and this has been true now for a number of years, is that Trump supporters are not going to go away. Sometimes people talk about somehow winning over Trump supporters. Not going to happen. And neither is the reverse going to happen. People who are anti-Trump, who had an unfavorable view of him, are not going to suddenly vote for him. So what's interesting, I think, and necessary to remember, is that a large part of the population is fixed in its views. They are not crossing the aisle. They are not changing their minds. New information, it doesn't matter what you tell them, whether that is true or not, they are simply not going to change their mind. They are dug in. And so you're really talking about a very small number of people, percentage-wise, in a very small number of states, right? Because there are a lot of states like New Jersey where obviously it's obvious that Trump doesn't stand a chance. I mean, it's hard to imagine any scenario in which Trump gets a plurality in New Jersey. And the same is true, let's say, of Oklahoma. It's hard to imagine any scenario where Joe Biden gets a plurality of votes in Oklahoma. So you're narrowed down to states that are competitive in terms of their registration, like Wisconsin or Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, a few others, Florida, of course. And you're now in those states, you have people who are deeply entrenched on both sides, either not going to change their minds, so you're talking about a fairly narrow slice of people. I think the dangerous thing in this election, of course, is the attempt to delegitimize it. The fact is that as we speak, Brian, we're 2 months before the election. Voting has already begun, right? In many states, mail-in balloting has already begun. And there's an effort by any number of people to say, well, that's somehow not legitimate. That somehow that's the result, especially if it's unfavorable to one candidate, is somehow corrupt, is rigged. And that is not good for American democracy. You know, as a pollster and as an impartial observer, I can say the most important thing about an election is that everybody recognizes that the result, whatever it is legitimate, and that it gives the right to take office to one candidate or one party and not the other. And that the losing side recognizes that they'll just have to try again in 2 years or 4 years, right? That's the most important thing about an election. And the most important thing about, say, a democracy, as opposed to a failed state, or as opposed to a puppet state, where these elections are simply window dressing. We actually have transitions of power from one coalition to another coalition, and remarkably enough, compared to the rest of the world in the last 200 years, we do that peacefully. So the most important thing for everybody to watch is themselves. As Americans, what we should be most proud of is that we've done this successfully now for well over 200 years. Let's keep it up.
That's a good point, and thank you for that. And the delegitimization that's we're seeing, reading about, is a good point, and also the fact that people are already voting. As soon as you said that, and I was thinking about that actually as well, that has to impact polling, because if 20% of the nation has already voted, and you're polling those people. I'm not you. I'm talking about the polling landscape of the country. There's going to be a different line of questioning this time around due to it being a different sort of process. Right? Is that right?
That's exactly right. So one of the questions we ask now that we wouldn't have asked, say, 6 months ago is, have you already voted or not? Right? So if you have voted, the question is, who did you vote for? And if you haven't voted, the question is, who would you vote for if you voted today? Right? So then we have to put those two results together. Now, a lot of people, I'm going to just anticipate, often ask me, and maybe you were too, well, do people lie on the phone? And the answer is, you know what? Probably a few do. But it's not necessarily a lie. Probably a few do. But the question is, first, is any misrepresentation of oneself systematic in one direction or another? Because if the misrepresentation of your own views is not systematic, then there's going to be no change in the aggregate result of the poll, right? The second question might be, are people simply over-reporting? Which people tend to do. So if you ask people, for example, are you going to vote? People tend to over-report their intention to vote. If you ask, are you willing to vote for a woman? People are going to over-report their willingness to vote for a woman. So these are not necessarily conscious, but unconscious ways that people misrepresent themselves. And of course, it's the job of the pollster to sort through that and find ways to get around it, which makes our experimental polling all the more interesting.
Very interesting. And then the one question, I don't know if you mentioned it or not, if in a general type of poll, political poll, where you're someone's contacting a household, are they asking for a certain, if it's not geared towards women or a certain age group or a certain party, and it's just looking for someone that's on the other end of the phone line, is there kind of a standard in terms of who you're asking for, or is it who picks up the phone? Or
right. So there are a number of questions that go on behind the scene. One of them is, are you driving? Right? Because if you're driving, maybe it's just not a good time for us to interview you. But if you're at home, we'll ask how many people are in your household, because of course that could be an important difference between different people's attitudes. But we also pick someone we random to interview in the house. We'll say, can we please speak to the person whose birthday falls closest to today, or the person in your household who most recently had a birthday? Or we'll say, can we speak to the youngest male in the house? There are a lot of ways to do it, but you're right. When there are multiple people in the home, you want to increase the chances of your randomization by randomizing in some way the people you're going to interview in that multi-person household.
very interesting. So even from the first contact point, it's randomized even at that level. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people would be aware of that.
Yeah. Of course, the phone numbers themselves are randomized. Maybe you won't be surprised to know that there are sampling companies out there that do nothing but sell randomized phone sample. So we buy a product. Of course, it's digital, and we load it and it's randomized into what we call replicates, and those replicates are randomized, and then when we extract the phone numbers from the replicate, they are re-randomized. So there's a lot of effort from beginning to end to try and shake up this jar of jelly beans to make sure that everything is evenly dispersed.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like an easy task. And another good point that you made in terms of landlines versus mobile, and people not having landlines these days, and large percentages, you're obviously going to come across people that even have mobile numbers where their area codes are associated with different states. So I just thought of that, because it pertains to myself. So, there's obviously a lot of challenges even even if you do end up, investing in Pollsters, investing in mobile kind of contacts and things like that. So I think it just highlights a lot of the challenges that go into it. Would you say that there's one overarching challenge in general from a pollster perspective, or is it just kind of a lot of what we've just talked about in terms of trying to get more insight into the active part from a political pollster standpoint, the active voter, digging into that, and also the unknown portion? Would those be probably the largest, outside of probably funding in terms of that? Obviously, if you had unlimited budget, you can probably dig in as much as you want.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, look, from the beginning of the realization that we could poll in the 1920s and 1930s, the effort, the challenge of randomizing your sample has been in the forefront. So almost 100 years later, that's still the challenge, because modes of communication and behaviors have changed. And so pollsters have always been in a constant race to keep up with all the possible methods of making sure you have a random sample. And that becomes enormously complicated. We probably don't have time or the patience to go into it now. And of course, the other side of that, I think you pointed out, is how do you know you've measured accurately what people actually think? And of course, that's what the FDU poll is really into. Not just what people think, but why they think it, and do they in fact think that? So, as with the example of the Jersey Shore, where so many people made the claim, even through polling, that the TV show Jersey Shore was somehow hurting New Jersey, we went at that a different way and demonstrated it was the opposite. That TV show was helping New Jersey. And it's the same thing with, by the way, with voting for president. I want to show you a standard slide where pollsters ask people, would you vote for a female president if she were qualified? And Gallup, for example, has been asking that poll for 70 years, right? And so let me show you this graphic that goes back to 1938 when Gallup first asked this question. It says, would you vote for a woman for president, right? And you can see this graph shows that in 1938, fewer than 40% said yes, they would vote for a woman for president. And in 2016, the percentage who say they would vote for a woman for president is about 95%. So it's a huge trend over a long number of years. And of course, I think most people and most people I know would say, well, of course I would vote for a woman. There's no problem I would have voting for a woman. But in fact, we ran a number of studies that showed that's not true. So, and we showed this with experimental populations, both in 2008 when Hillary Clinton was running against Barack Obama, and in 2016 when she was running against a different man. In fact, her being a female in and of itself hurt her. And we weren't asking people, would you vote for a woman for president? What we did was, at random, we asked half our sample, did they who were being interviewed, did they or their spouse make more money in the household? Now, we didn't care whether they were married, and we didn't really care whether or not they made more money or less money than their spouse. What we cared about was just asking the question, do you or your spouse make more money? Just introducing the thought that there is a difference between what men make and what women make. And some people find that threatening and upsetting. Well, when you get to the question of who are you going to vote for? Who do you favor in this election? Both these samples should really be the same. The sample who were not asked this question initially about do you make more money than your spouse or not? And this part of the sample, the other sample that was not asked that question, they should have the same vote preference. But that wasn't the case at all. In fact, there was about a 20-point swing between the percentage of support for Hillary Clinton in the one sample compared to the other. In other words, thinking about who makes more money, men or women, was enough to torpedo Hillary's vote preference between those two samples, which means that people really do have a hang-up about voting for women. And it's, by the way, it's both men and women, much more men than women, but it does cover both genders.
It's very interesting how you have to kind of target some underlying factors in order to actually get the what may be the truth out, in terms of how you talked about the New Jersey Shore and that slide as well. I think listeners and definitely the viewers that saw those slides will find that very interesting. So that I think we're going to wrap it up in a minute, but I just wanted to ask, and I think you laid it out nicely already, but why should people, with all these challenges that we see, you know, you've talked about quite a few of them yourself, why should people even be interested in measuring public opinion? People, corporations, you know, outside the outside world, when they already have their own thoughts, they consider themselves educated, they make, you know, they consider themselves critical thinkers and things like that. So what is the value of measuring public opinion in your opinion?
So yeah, that's my favorite question, because my answer is participating in polls and measuring public opinion is an integral part of a well-functioning democracy. And it is a check on all the lawmakers, all the interest group leaders, all the carnival barkers who claim to speak for the public. And there are a lot of them out there, from your local council to your challenger to the local council to your presidential candidates to preachers and all kinds of interest group leaders. They all claim to speak for the public. Well, somebody has to step in and sort it all out. So, you know, it's not just about polling vote preferences for presidential candidates or your state senator. It's about asking people about their real policy preferences, right? Are you pro-gun? Are you anti-gun? Are you pro-life? Are you pro-choice? There are hundreds of important issues at the national level and the state level on which people pontificate and on which people claim to have the support of public opinion, but only pollsters can really go into the field and find out how the public really believes and how it really breaks down on these issues. And of course, when pollsters show those results, politicians pay attention, right? There are issues that they will pursue because they see a green light, and there are issues that they'll drop, like a hot potato, because suddenly they see a red light. So polling is an excellent way to check the big mouths who claim to speak for the public, and it's an excellent way to influence public policy. It's an excellent way to shine light on the debates in your legislature or the debates between your governor and your legislature. It's an excellent way to supplement the electoral process, which we all know is in a way crude, right? Because at the end of the day, you're voting for this candidate and his or her set of positives and negatives, or you're voting for this candidate and his or her set of positives and negatives, right? It's very crude in that way. But polling can not only ask you which set of negatives and positives you're going to embrace, it can go issue by issue and find out what it is that, what policies actually you support or you oppose. And that's enormously helpful to a democracy as a linkage, as a communication between people and policymakers. And without that communication between the people and the policymakers, you don't really have a democracy.
No, I agree. That's a great point. And I just think about it in terms of, you turn on the TV and you see campaign commercials, right? Who has the biggest budget to reach us via TV or radio or through online social media ads? And that may appear like someone's dominating a race, but in the end, you need some sort of democratic process in order to get as close as you can to what is the actual public opinion on a topic such as that. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. I think we covered a lot today. If you have anything else that you want to leave us with in terms of things to look out for, I think what you just said there, if anyone's contacted for a poll, I think it would be a good idea to actually take part in it and treat it almost as if you are voting. But that's
You're exactly right. Yeah.
It's going to influence public opinion. It's going to influence political leaders, and it's going to influence decision making. So I think that's important to take away. But Dr. Woolley, do you have anything else that you want to leave us with? And also, if anyone needs to contact you for anything, or you said you obviously work with other companies and corporations. Some of them actually listen to the show, so I'm sure it's all available through FDU, easily to find and Google search and things like that. But anything you want to leave us with before we part ways?
Well, you're right. Okay, so if you need a poll, you can contact the FDU poll. It's pretty easy to find on the internet. But if you don't need a poll, pollsters need you. So just like there are a lot of people out there now saying, vote, it's your obligation to vote, I would say respond to polls, to legitimate polls, because it's part and parcel of democracy itself, of the linkage between the people who are governed and that smaller group who are governing us. Let's amplify what we think and parse out what we think by responding to those pollsters.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thanks again for joining the show. I know it's been about an hour, so we appreciate your time here on the Garden State Debate, and we look forward to speaking to you again. Maybe we can catch up after the election or sometime around that, if you're available, and we can break it down. All right, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Take care.
Garden State Debate, where the talk is real. Garden State Debate, no joke, no frills. Garden State Debate, it's the talk of the town. Garden State Debate, for people all around. Yeah, Garden State Debate, Garden State Debate, Garden State Debate.